We usually see ancient Athens as the birthplace of democracy, and there's good reason to do so. During the classical era of ancient Greece, Athens, among other city-states, developed a form of government that allowed the participation of larger parts of the population than any other political system seen in Europe up until this date, at least in recorded history. In theory, every citizen could participate in politics, and every citizen was expected to as well. In this regard, one could argue that Athens was even more democratic than modern democracies, in which politics are largely done by elected representatives and not by the citizens directly. But was this system really so unique, or did similar systems also exist in other parts of Europe? In this video, I'm going to try to answer this question by comparing the way Athenian democracy worked to two other systems of government, which are tested among the tribes of ancient Gaul and Germania. In order to do so, we will first take a close look at the institutions and the systems of Athenian democracy, before doing the same in respect to the ancient Gauls and Germans. First up, the Athenian democracy. According to the Swiss historian Kurt Raaflaub, Athenian democracy can be traced back to a perhaps somewhat unlikely origin: the near-constant warfare between the individual Greek city-states, the so-called poleis. Whereas war in earlier periods was characterized by close-quarters hand-to-hand fighting, from the 8th century onwards, the ancient Greeks underwent the so-called Hoplite revolution, a citizen army made up by the middle class, characterized by the use of large round shields in conjunction with extremely long spears, arranged in an impenetrable wall referred to as a phalanx. Through this revolution, the average middle-class citizen became more important for the security of their respective polis, and leveraged this increase in responsibility to obtain more rights of political participation. In the case of Athens in particular, which was one of the great naval powers of its time, even the lowest class of society, the so-called thetes, became crucial for the security and the prosperity of the burgeoning Athenian empire as rowers on their ships, and they as well demanded more rights. But these weren't the only causes. During this period, Greek colonies started to spring up all over the Mediterranean, which brought wealth back to Greece. But with this wealth came an increase of social differentiation, which in turn led to general unrest among those people who didn't directly profit from these overseas ventures, which again was the middle class. Eventually, the lower and middle classes believed that they could do just as good a job at ruling as the upper classes, which the historian Ian Morris has termed the strong principle of equality. This in turn eventually led to political reforms. The first of these was initiated by a man called Solon in 494 BC. He divided citizens into 4 classes based on agricultural production. While only the top classes could hold high office, even the poorest obtained citizenship, and with it the right to elect these officials and to participate in a citizen assembly, the so-called Ecclesia. Though technically every citizen had the right to speak at the assembly, it was still dominated by members of the aristocracy. This issue was exacerbated by the fact that many of the poorer Athenians couldn't afford to travel to the city and participate in the assemblies. This was somewhat countered by another institution that Solon created, the Boule, a council of 400 citizens that decided about the assembly's agenda, thus ensuring the aristocracy didn't have total control over what was discussed. Solon also created a citizen-run court, the so-called Heliaia. Crucially, he introduced the right of appeal, allowing citizens to challenge the decisions of aristocratic magistrates. These courts could be massive and often consisted of hundreds of citizens who together decided about the enactment of laws and punishment. There were no professional judges or lawyers, citizens argued their own cases and the jury decided by secret ballot. Almost a century later, in 408 BC, Cleisthenes continued Solon's work by replacing traditional family-based power structures with the so-called 10 tribes. These tribes were based on geography rather than on familial ties, thus breaking up the old clan-like power structures of the aristocracy. He ensured that each tribe included people from all major parts of Attica, the coast, the rural inland, and the city. Thus he forced people from different economic and social backgrounds to work together to improve all of their lives collectively. He also expanded the Boule to 500 people, so that each tribe could be represented by 50 individuals. These members were chosen by lot and served on the council for 1 year. Apart from deciding on the Ecclesia's agenda, they now also handled the city's daily business and finances. Because every citizen could be chosen randomly, everyone had to stay informed about the current political situation to be able to best represent his tribes and the city's interests when called upon. Cleisthenes also introduced the infamous practice of ostracism, which gave the assembly the right to vote once a year to exile a citizen for 10 years. This was supposed to work as a last resort in case any one citizen accumulated too much power and started threatening the democratic system. The gradual transformation from an aristocracy to a full democracy was eventually completed by Ephialtes in 461 BC, when he stripped the last leftover institution of the old aristocratic order, the so-called Areopagus, a council of aristocrats, of its power, transferring it to the assembly, the bullae, and the law courts. He also determined that some officials should be elected rather than chosen by lot, among them the strategos, the generals of the Athenian armed forces, because it was deemed that men with expertise were better suited for this particular position. They were the only major officials who could be re-elected indefinitely. It was also during this period that Pericles, perhaps the most famous Athenian democratic leader, introduced payments for political participation. Even though citizens of all economic classes had been granted the right to participate in Athenian politics almost a century and a half earlier by Solon, few could actually afford to attend the assembly or the bullae, because they couldn't afford to miss a day's work, especially if they had to travel from outside of the city to attend. To address this issue and to enable these people to participate, Pericles started paying them wages, thus enabling more people to participate in Athenian politics. Despite all of these achievements, Athenian democracy still had major flaws. The most severe of these was that only free, adult male Athenians, born to two Athenian parents, could participate. This was only about 15% of the total population. Women, slaves, and metics, that is, foreign residents, were excluded. And whilst theoretically everyone could speak at the assemblies, in practice only a few influential demagogues, that is, leaders of the people, usually dominated the debates. So Athenian democracy wasn't really a government of the people, but only of its free male population, and they in turn were still strongly influenced by a group of elite few individuals. Nevertheless, this system still ensured the political participation of a broader part of the population than in the vast majority of other ancient societies. Though there might be one or two overlooked exceptions to this rule, which we will now take a closer look at, namely the government systems of ancient Gaul and Germania. Unfortunately, we don't have any sources that go back as far as the ones concerning Athens, so we don't have any detailed descriptions about the political organization of Celtic and Germanic groups during this period. Based on grave goods in these regions, however, we can make two essential observations. The Celts appear to have lived in stratified societies with distinct social classes that were at least in part defined by personal wealth, indicated by high-status burials with lavish grave goods. Meanwhile, their Germanic neighbors to the north completely lack any kind of differentiation in their burial customs, which has led some scholars to believe that the Germanic people of this period lived in relatively egalitarian societies without a social elite. Whether that is true or not is difficult to determine, however, as the wealth of a society doesn't necessarily determine its form of government. Ancient Athens is an excellent example of this. Democracy there didn't abolish the economic differences between classes, although it did lead to increased protection of the lower ranks of society from exploitation by the social elite. On the other hand, it has been observed in many prehistoric and historic societies that leadership concentrated in a single person or a small group of people often requires a surplus of wealth by which these people could exert influence over others. As there are no signs for such a surplus among the early Germanic people, leadership roles probably weren't based on wealth. Other immaterial characteristics may have played a role, however, such as age, experience, or popular opinion, or a combination of all three aspects. In so-called Gerontocracies, a community is governed by a group of elders, and this practice has been observed among societies that don't live on the basis of a surplus economy. In such groups, power can sometimes be passed on from one elder to the next in line, so a dynastic element could have played a role in such a society, especially if familial ties and kinship were held in high regard, as has been observed in most Indo-European societies. Another possibility is a model based on leadership by experience or merit. In this scenario, instead of age, experience in certain areas is considered crucial for a leader. These kinds of leaders are often elected either by the actual casting of votes or just by general popular opinion. Because this kind of leadership is based on the trust of the people, it could be seen as democratic. But what about the Celts? Whilst they hadn't quite reached the heights of the late Iron Age operative civilization yet, their societies were probably still more complex than those of their northern Germanic neighbors. Though they hadn't started building towns and cities on the scale of the operator yet, fortified settlements dotted the landscape, and in their vicinity, rich, sometimes even princely graves have been found, indicating that the majority of the wealth and probably also the power of Celtic society was concentrated in a small social elite. If that is the case, then why would we even include them in this comparison with Athenian democracy? Well, if we fast forward to the 1st century BC, to the time when Caesar provides us with a detailed glimpse of Celtic politics and society, we do find some potentially democratic elements among them. Caesar tells us of a certain office among the Gauls, which he refers to as magistrates. The power of these magistrates varied among the various Gallic tribes, but they all had in common that they were elected, although unfortunately Caesar doesn't make it quite clear who had the right to elect them. Another element that is reminiscent of Athenian democracy is what Caesar refers to as senati. These were councils that were apparently similar enough to the Senate in Rome that Caesar used the same term to describe them. According to him, they were used to discuss current matters of state and either advised the ruling party on the correct course of action or, in some cases, were the ruling body themselves. Again, Caesar doesn't tell us who exactly was allowed to participate in these Gaulish Senate meetings, so we can't say for certain that this institution was democratic in nature, but at least it allowed for the political participation of a larger number of people than in other systems of government, such as an absolute monarchy. In summary, we can't conclude that Gaulish society was truly democratic. It might have had certain democratic elements, but it probably is better described as an aristocracy than a democracy. Interestingly, Caesar also has some remarks about the political systems he found across the Rhine among what he termed Germani. Now, it is important to keep in mind that this term is a highly difficult one to handle as its meaning changed over time. It was probably first used to describe a group of tribes on both sides of the Lower Rhine by a Greek polymath called Posidonius during the first half of the 1st century BC, and these tribes were probably not Germanic in terms of their material culture or language, at least not according to most modern scholars. Caesar then used the term to describe all populations across the Rhine and north of the Danube. Whilst some of them definitely were Germanic in both material culture and language, other groups in this area differed substantially in terms of their material culture, and it is thus often assumed that they also didn't speak a Germanic language, at least not yet. From an archaeological perspective, Germania during this time could be divided into 4 main areas. The south used to be a core territory of the Latin culture, which is usually associated with Celtic-speaking groups, but had been largely abandoned by them and now lay mostly uninhabited. The northeast was occupied by the so-called Jastorf culture, and it is this culture which most scholars identify with the earliest Germanic-speaking groups. It is also this culture that was characterized by its apparently relatively egalitarian structures, which I described earlier. The West, meanwhile, was still part of the broader Latin horizon, but had its own regional flavor, which showed particularly close connections to the left bank of the Rhine. On the basis of their material culture, it has often been argued that they weren't originally Germanic, but either Celtic, or that they spoke a language between Germanic and Celtic that has since largely been lost. And to the northwest lay groups that were in somewhat of an intermediate position between the Latin culture to the south and the Jastorf culture to the east, and their linguistic and cultural affiliation is unclear. These differences in material culture are important to keep in mind when we discuss what Caesar refers to as Germanic, as he probably primarily came into contact with members of the Western Latin group, which may not have been Germanic in a linguistic sense and also hadn't been influenced strongly by the definitely Germanic Jastorf culture yet. The only one of these groups that he describes in any kind of detail are the Ubii. They were located on the eastern bank of the Lower Rhine and resembled the Gauls in many areas according to Caesar, and most importantly for us, also in their political structures. Similarly to them, they also had a senate which was comprised of the social elite of the Ubii. He contrasts them and the Western Germanic tribes in general from the Suebi, which he locates further east beyond them, roughly in the territory of the archaeological Yastov culture. Unfortunately, he doesn't tell us anything of substance about their society, their political systems or institutions, but he tells us of a king among them by the name of Ariovistus, who had led part of the Suebi and other tribes across the Rhine prior to Caesar's arrival in Gaul to establish a realm of his own. So we know that there was at least one king among the Suebi, which strongly contradicts the idea of democratic institutions among them. But we should keep in mind that we're confronted with this monarch far from his homeland and at the head of a variety of tribes, or probably parts of tribes, from various parts of Central Europe. So we don't know if the institution of kingship was an essential part of Germanic society, or if it just arose due to the special circumstances these particular groups and Ariovistus found themselves in. Perhaps consulting another source might help clear things up a bit. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, who wrote a century and a half after Caesar towards the end of the 1st century AD, there wasn't just one Germanic society and culture, but multiple larger groups which could be divided further into the tribes we are familiar with. So we can expect that there were differences in political institutions as well. Whilst he tells us of kings among Germanic tribes east of the river Elbe and the river Oder, we don't hear of them in Western Germania. So while kingship as an institution seems to have existed, it wasn't a universal feature of Germanic society. And it should be noted that where Germanic kingship existed, apparently it wasn't strictly dynastic. Instead, Tacitus tells us that kings were elected from an aristocratic class which he refers to as nobilitates. Apparently, certain checks and balances were also imposed upon them, so they couldn't rule with impunity, although Tacitus doesn't tell us which restrictions these were exactly. In addition to the kings, Tacitus also tells us of so-called duces, which are usually interpreted as military leaders, perhaps similar to the Athenian strategos. They were also elected, but not from among a specific social class. Instead, they were chosen solely on the basis of their martial skills, and according to some scholars, they were only elected when there was a need for military leadership. Also elected were so-called principes, which in the context of Tacitus' text seem to refer to a kind of judge on a smaller, more local level. Apparently, some of them were accompanied by administrative staff that could number up to 100 individuals, indicating that they weren't just village heads or chieftains, but that they oversaw multiple communities within a tribe, and interestingly, they too were elected. The election of these various posts and offices took place in a kind of assembly in which every free man could participate, similar to the Athenian Ecclesia. That being said, it is likely that the class of free men in ancient Germania probably comprised a larger part of the population than was the case in Athens, as the number of ineligible slaves and foreigners was likely considerably lower. Apart from elections, the Germanic assemblies also served as an open forum to discuss political and social matters that were relevant to the tribe as a whole. Although technically every free man could speak at these assemblies, in reality the social elite dominated the political discourse at these events, again similar to the Athenian Ecclesia. So, in conclusion, Germanic society seems to have been considerably more democratic than Gallic society. Every free man had a right to participate in the political process and to elect the leaders in peace and in war. That being said, all of Germania seems to have retained a certain aristocratic class at the top of the social hierarchy, and in the case of the tribes east of the Elbe, monarchical elements could be found as well. Based on the archaeological evidence, this aristocratic element only started to develop relatively late from the 1st century BC onwards, when we are first confronted with richer grey furnishings among the Yastov culture. So before this period, Germanic society might have been more democratic. But what are your thoughts on this? Do you think Athens is the birthplace of democracy, or was early Germanic society perhaps even more democratic? Let me know in the comments below, and whilst you're down there, consider liking the video if you liked it and subscribing to be notified by future uploads. You can also consider becoming a channel member to support my research and to get early access to all of my future videos. All support is greatly appreciated and will help me fund my PhD. But for now, thank you so much for watching, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next one.